The suitcase hit the porch with a dull, hollow thud. For a moment, nobody spoke. The night air in Portland carried the smell of wet pavement and cedar from the neighbor's yard. A porch light flickered above us, casting a pale yellow circle over the scene. My suitcase, my laptop bag, and 2 cardboard boxes filled with the last things I had kept from my husband. "Get out," Tiffany Mercer said flatly from the doorway. "We don't need a penniless old woman living off us." Her voice was sharp enough that the neighbor across the street paused halfway up his walkway. I remember noticing that. A tall man with a grocery bag in his hand, standing still as if he had accidentally walked into the middle of something private. Behind Tiffany, my son Andrew stood with his hands in his pockets. He wasn't looking at me. He wasn't looking at anything. He was looking at the floorboards between us. For a long moment, I simply stood there absorbing the shape of the moment. My suitcase resting on painted wood, my son silent, his wife waiting for a reaction. Perhaps they expected shouting, or tears, or the kind of desperate pleading that makes people feel justified afterward. Instead, I bent down, lifted the handle of the suitcase, and said quietly, "All right." That was the moment everything changed. What they didn't know, what neither of them had ever bothered to ask, was that they had just thrown the wrong woman out of their house. My name is Laura Kensington, and I was 60 years old the night my son helped carry my life onto a porch in the rain. Before I continue, if you're new here, consider subscribing and tell me in the comments which city you're listening from. I always like seeing how far these stories travel, but to understand how a mother ends up standing on a porch with a suitcase and nowhere to go, you have to go back a little further, back to a time when I still believed my family understood who I was. My husband, Robert Kensington, died when I was 43. It was a quiet Tuesday morning in early spring. A heart condition we had thought we were managing suddenly decided otherwise. One moment we were discussing whether the roses in the yard needed pruning, and the next I was sitting in a hospital hallway, staring at a doctor whose mouth kept moving while the world went silent around me. Grief, I discovered, is a strangely practical thing. You cry, of course. You remember. You replay conversations that now seem unbearably precious. But you also have bills to pay, a mortgage, a teenager who needs shoes and rides to soccer practice. Andrew was 15 when Robert died. For the next few years, my life narrowed to a very simple mission: keep things moving forward. Robert had always been careful with money. He left us with stability but not abundance. Enough to breathe, not enough to stop working. So I built something. At first it was small. I began selling vintage furniture and estate finds online, pieces people considered outdated, but that still had craftsmanship and history in them. Old writing desks, carved mirrors, walnut cabinets that had survived 3 generations in someone's dining room before being discarded. I loved rescuing those pieces, giving them another life. Over time, I learned something else as well. Most antique dealers had no idea how to sell online. They knew wood and history and restoration, but the internet baffled them. So I began helping them, first casually, then professionally. Within 10 years, my small resale hobby had turned into 3 separate streams of work: sourcing and restoring vintage pieces, consulting with antique dealers on building online stores, and teaching them how to run those systems themselves. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. By the time I turned 60, my business was bringing in about $50,000 a month. I had close to $9 million in savings and investments, and my house in Salem, Oregon was fully paid off. I never told anyone that. Not my neighbors, not my church friends, and certainly not Andrew. That decision wasn't about secrecy, it was about observation. Robert used to say something that stayed with me long after he was gone. Money changes the people around you before it changes you. I had watched it happen in his family when his sister inherited their mother's estate. People who had been perfectly pleasant suddenly became very interested in dinner invitations, very interested in advice, very interested in reminding her how close they had always been. I didn't want that. I didn't want to be a bank account with a grandmother's face attached. So I lived quietly. I drove a practical car. I wore clothes from places like Costco and Chico's. My home in Salem was comfortable but unremarkable, full of plants, books, and the quiet rhythm of a woman who liked her mornings peaceful. And Andrew, for most of his life, seemed to appreciate that. He was my only child, kind, thoughtful, steady in ways Robert had always hoped he would become. When he met Tiffany Mercer, I wanted very much to believe she would become part of that steadiness. She was younger than Andrew by several years, bright and ambitious, with a carefully polished confidence that impressed people quickly. At first I told myself she simply needed time. The first warning sign was small. During Thanksgiving dinner about 6 months after their wedding, I noticed a photograph had disappeared from the living room mantel in their Portland house. It was a photo of Robert and me from Andrew's college graduation. When I asked about it, Andrew smiled a little awkwardly. "Tiffany's updating the look of the room," he said. "You know, aesthetics." I nodded and passed the cranberry sauce. The second warning sign arrived at Easter. We were sitting around the table when Tiffany laughed lightly and said something about how difficult it must be for older people living alone on a fixed income. I remember pausing with my glass of iced tea halfway to my lips. At that moment, my business was running 3 revenue streams, but I simply smiled and said nothing. The third warning sign came that autumn when Andrew called me from Portland. "Mom," he said carefully, "have you ever thought about selling the Salem house and moving up here?" He explained it gently. They had a guest room. Portland was a bigger city. It would be easier for everyone if we were closer together. At the time, I didn't ask the question I should have asked. Easier for whom? Instead, I sat at my kitchen table in Salem, looking out at the quiet garden Robert had planted 20 years earlier. The evenings had been getting longer lately. The house felt larger every year. And Andrew was my son. So I said the words that would slowly, quietly set everything else in motion. "All right," I told him. "Maybe it's time." Over the next few months, the idea grew slowly into a plan. Conversations about practicality, about family, about starting a new chapter in Portland, and little by little, almost, without noticing when the decision truly became final, I began preparing to sell the house in Salem and move north. At the time, it felt like the natural next step. I had no idea it was also the beginning of the worst mistake I had made in 17 years. Selling the house in Salem did not happen overnight. It unfolded gradually, the way most life-changing decisions do, through a series of small conversations that feel harmless at the time. Andrew would call every week or so. Sometimes it was practical. Portland had more opportunity, he said. More people, more markets for the kind of business I was running. Sometimes it was emotional. "The house in Salem must feel lonely," he told me gently. "Wouldn't it be nice to have family nearby again?" And sometimes Tiffany joined the conversation. She was always polite, always careful with her tone. But there was something about the way she framed things that slowly nudged the idea forward. "You shouldn't have to manage a whole house by yourself at your age," she said once. Not unkindly, just efficiently. Over time, the idea took root. I spoke with my financial advisor, Allison Reed, about restructuring some investments if I moved. I talked with my real estate attorney, Dana Whitaker, about the process of selling property in Oregon. The house sold in December. It was a strange feeling watching strangers walk through rooms that still held echoes of Robert's voice and Andrew's childhood. The garden Robert had planted 20 years earlier passed quietly into someone else's care. But I told myself something simple. Life moves forward. And in January, with 2 suitcases, my laptop, several external hard drives containing my business systems, and 2 carefully packed boxes of Robert's things, I drove north to Portland. Andrew and Tiffany lived on Maplewood Drive, a quiet street lined with older craftsman homes and wide trees that shaded the sidewalks. It looked like the kind of neighborhood where people knew each other's dogs and waved when they drove past. Andrew greeted me in the driveway with a hug that felt sincere and slightly rushed. "Mom, you made good time," he said. Tiffany appeared behind him on the porch with a pleasant smile. "Laura, welcome," she said. She never called me Mom. Not once. At the time, I told myself that was simply personal preference. The guest room was small but comfortable. A neat space with a window overlooking the backyard and just enough room for a bed, a small desk, and the rolling chair I used for work. For the first few weeks, everything felt almost normal. I woke early as I always had. Around 4 in the morning, the house would still be silent, and I would sit at the desk answering emails from antique dealers in different time zones, reviewing listings and managing shipments. By 8 o'clock, my workday's most complicated tasks were usually finished. Andrew would come downstairs around then pouring coffee while scrolling through his phone. Tiffany started later. Her candle business, Lumiere Home Candles she called it, operated mostly online and through local craft markets. She liked to sleep in when she could. At first the rhythm seemed manageable, then the adjustments began. They were small enough that each one felt reasonable on its own. One morning, Tiffany mentioned that the sound of my keyboard carried down the hallway earlier than she liked, so I bought a quieter keyboard. A week later, she said the light from my laptop under the door was visible when she walked past at night. So I began closing the door fully and placing a towel at the bottom. Another week passed. "I can hear your calls sometimes," she said lightly during breakfast. Clients, I mean. So I started using headphones and speaking more softly. It's surprising how quickly a person can begin shrinking themselves. I adjusted my schedule. I shortened my calls. I worked with the door closed and the lights dimmed. At first, I told myself it was temporary. Living together always required compromise, but the compromises seemed to move in only one direction. The house slowly began to feel less like a place I lived and more like a place I was temporarily occupying. Tiffany's candle supplies gradually expanded into the dining room. Boxes of wax, scent oils, and shipping materials appeared on the kitchen counter. Then one afternoon, I overheard a conversation that stayed with me longer than it should have. Tiffany and Andrew were in the living room discussing space. "That guest room would make a perfect studio," she said. "The light in there is great." Andrew's voice was quieter. "Mom's using it for work." "She won't forever," Tiffany replied calmly. I remember standing in the hallway with a folder in my hand, listening to the quiet certainty in her voice. At the time, I told myself not to read too much into it, but something in the atmosphere of the house had shifted. The feeling of being welcome slowly faded into something more conditional. The final moment came on a damp evening in mid-March. I had been on a video call with a client in London. Time zones make schedules unpredictable, and the call ran about 20 minutes longer than planned. When I stepped into the hallway afterward, Tiffany was standing there waiting. Her arms were folded neatly across her chest. Andrew stood a few feet behind her. "Laura," she said, "not angry, just precise. We need to talk about boundaries." I nodded and followed them into the kitchen. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. I know that because later, lying awake in a hotel room, I replayed every word until the time stamped itself into my memory. Tiffany spoke calmly at first. "This arrangement isn't working the way we hoped," she said. She explained that the guest room had originally been intended for her expanding candle business, that the house felt crowded, that living together required certain adjustments. Andrew said very little. He kept his eyes on the kitchen table. Then Tiffany said the sentence that would replay in my mind for weeks afterward. "You're essentially living here for free," she said, "and frankly, we don't need a penniless old woman taking up space in our house." The words hung in the air like a dropped glass. I turned slowly toward my son. Andrew did not look up. "Tiffany," he said quietly, though not in protest, more like someone acknowledging that something had been said out loud. "You should start packing," she continued. "Tonight would be best." For a few seconds, nobody moved. Then Andrew stood. He walked down the hallway toward the guest room. I heard the faint scrape of the suitcase being pulled from under the bed. Something inside my chest folded in on itself, not breaking exactly, just compressing into a smaller shape. Andrew returned, carrying the suitcase. He set it gently beside the front door. Then he went back for my laptop bag. Then the 2 boxes containing Robert's things. He placed them carefully on the porch outside, neatly, almost thoughtfully. The precision of it made the moment worse somehow. I stood in the kitchen doorway watching my entire life reduced to a small pile beneath the porch light. Before I continue, I want to ask you something. If you had been standing where I was that night watching your own child carry your belongings outside, what would you have done? Tell me in the comments. And if this moment shocked you as much as it shocked me, leave a like so I know I'm not the only one who felt it. Andrew returned to the doorway. The night air drifted in behind him. "It's probably better this way," he said quietly. I picked up my laptop bag. Then I lifted the handle of the suitcase. For the first time that evening, Andrew finally looked at me. There was something in his eyes then, something that might have been regret or guilt or simply exhaustion. But he still said nothing. I stepped onto the porch. Behind me, the front door closed, and within a few minutes my suitcase, my laptop bag, and 2 boxes containing the last pieces of Robert Kensington's life were sitting alone on a wooden porch beneath a pale yellow light as I walked down the steps and into the rain. I drove for nearly 20 minutes before I realized I had no idea where I was going. The streets of Portland slid past the windshield in quiet ribbons of rain and traffic lights. My suitcase lay in the back seat beside the boxes of Robert's things, the cardboard shifting slightly every time I turned a corner. For most of my adult life, I had always known my destination. That night, I simply drove. Eventually, the car turned itself almost by instinct into the driveway of a large glass building near the river, the Hyatt Regency Portland. I parked under the awning and sat there for a moment with both hands resting on the steering wheel. The rain tapped gently against the windshield. It felt strangely peaceful. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of citrus and polished marble. A young man behind the reception desk greeted me with the practiced calm of someone who had seen every variety of traveler pass through his evening shift. "Good evening," he said. "Checking in." "Yes," I replied. "For 3 nights." He handed me a key card and pointed me toward the elevators. I paid in cash from an emergency envelope I had carried in my laptop bag for years, a habit Robert had insisted on long ago. "You never know when you'll need options," he used to say. The room was quiet. Neutral hotel furniture, a wide bed, a window looking out over the river where the lights of the city reflected softly on the water. I placed the suitcase near the chair. Then I sat down on the edge of the bed. For the first time that evening, the silence caught up with me. I allowed myself exactly 45 minutes. That number might sound oddly specific, but I had learned something over the years about grief and panic. If you give them boundaries, they behave better. So I sat there and cried, not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly, the way a person cries when the world they trusted shifts under their feet. I cried for Robert first. That was always the instinct when something in life went wrong. Robert would have known what to say. He would have known when to speak, and when simply to sit beside me until the moment passed. Then I cried for Andrew, not the man who had carried my suitcase outside, but the boy who once refused to sleep without the hallway light on because thunderstorms frightened him. And finally, briefly, I cried for myself. At the 46th minute, I stood up, washed my face in the bathroom sink, and opened my laptop. There is a trick I learned years ago in business negotiations and personal loss alike. When emotions become overwhelming, you start with something simpler. You start with facts. I opened a blank document and typed a single heading, "What is true?" Then I began writing. I am 60 years old. I am healthy. I have no debt. My business generated approximately $50,000 last month. I have roughly $1.9 million in savings and investments. Tonight I was called a penniless old woman by someone who has never asked me a single question about my life. My son stood beside her and said nothing. I read the list twice. The facts sat quietly on the screen, neither comforting nor cruel, just clear. Then I added one more line. This situation does not define what happens next. For the next 3 days, I lived in 2 emotional states simultaneously. In the mornings, I worked, emails to antique dealers, inventory updates, consulting calls with clients who had no idea their advisor was currently living in a hotel room. In the afternoons, I planned. Portland was a large city. Renting a place temporarily would not be difficult. On the 3rd day, I found a furnished apartment in Selwood Moorland, a quiet neighborhood not far from Andrews Street. The landlord was delighted when I offered to pay 6 months in advance. People rarely ask many questions when the check clears immediately. The apartment was modest but charming. High ceilings, Old hardwood floors, a kitchen window that looked out over a narrow backyard where a maple tree stood just beginning to show the first green hints of spring. I moved in with my suitcase, my laptop, and Robert's 2 boxes. The first thing I bought was a plant, a pothos, the kind that survives almost anything. I placed it on the kitchen windowsill where the light fell gently across the leaves. Then I sat down on the rented sofa and allowed myself something I had been avoiding. Not feeling. Thinking. There is a difference. For the first time since the confrontation in Andrew's kitchen, I replayed Tiffany's words without the fog of shock surrounding them. Penniless old woman. The phrase hadn't come from nowhere. It had been delivered too confidently, too precisely, as if she had rehearsed the idea long before saying it out loud. And Andrew's silence. That bothered me more than anything else. He had not looked surprised. He had not argued. He had simply carried my suitcase. Slowly, piece by piece, a realization settled into place. Andrew and Tiffany hadn't reacted impulsively that night. They had acted on an assumption about who I was. A small, dependent version of me they had quietly constructed over months. The mother who lived on a fixed income. The guest who should be grateful for a spare room. The burden that could eventually be moved somewhere else. The woman they had thrown out of their house wasn't me. It was a version of me they had invented, and that realization brought something unexpected with it. Clarity. I stood up from the sofa, walked to the kitchen, and poured a glass of water. Outside, the evening light settled softly over the Selwood street. The pothos plant shifted slightly in the window as a breeze slipped through the screen. For the first time since leaving Maplewood Drive, I felt my breathing slow. Then I returned to the sofa, opened my laptop again, and began looking at the situation with the calm attention of someone solving a problem rather than surviving a shock. Andrew and Tiffany believed something about me, something very specific, and suddenly I realized that belief gave me a very unusual kind of advantage. I opened a browser tab, then another. Finally, almost absent-mindedly, I typed a single website address into the search bar. Zillow.com. And the first thing I did was enter the address of my son's house on Maplewood Drive. The Zillow page loaded slowly, the small blue progress bar crawling across the top of my laptop screen. Outside the apartment window, the evening in Selwood had grown quiet. Somewhere down the street a dog barked once and then stopped as if reminded that the neighborhood had already settled into its nightly rhythm. I typed the address carefully. Maplewood Drive. Andrew and Tiffany's house appeared almost immediately, an aerial image. First then, the street view I had driven past only a few nights earlier. For a moment, I simply studied the map. Houses arranged in neat rectangles, driveways, fences, a scattering of trees that had probably been planted decades ago. Then something caught my eye. Across the street from Andrew's house, one of the homes was marked with a small red label, "For Sale." I leaned forward slightly. The property photo opened. A pale blue craftsman house with white trim, a narrow front porch, and a garden that had clearly been neglected for at least one season. The listing notes explained that the owner had relocated unexpectedly and was looking for a quick sale. Price $720,000. I sat back in the chair. Sometimes life presents an opportunity so quietly that it almost feels accidental. But opportunities are rarely accidents. They are intersections, moments where preparation meets circumstance. And suddenly, I could see the entire intersection clearly. If I wanted distance from Andrew and Tiffany, Portland offered hundreds of neighborhoods. If I wanted privacy, there were entire counties within driving distance. But if what I wanted was something slightly different, something more educational, then the house across the street from my son's might be the most interesting option Portland had to offer. I picked up my phone and called Allison Reed. Allison had managed my financial planning for nearly 8 years. She was one of those calm, practical people who believed numbers were simply stories told in a more precise language. She answered on the third ring. "Laura," she said warmly, "everything all right? I need to ask you a hypothetical question," I replied. There was a brief pause on the line. "That usually means it isn't hypothetical," Allison said. I smiled faintly. I'm considering purchasing property in Portland, I explained. Cash purchase. Around $700,000. That's easily manageable, she said. Would this be a primary residence or investment property? Let's call it strategic housing. Allison laughed softly. Well, from a financial standpoint, it makes perfect sense. Your liquidity can handle it without touching long-term investments. I'd also like the purchase made through the trust, I added. Kensington Legacy Trust, yes. That keeps the transaction private, she said immediately, understanding my thought before I finished the sentence. The name won't appear publicly in connection with you. Exactly. Then you'll want Dana involved. Allison continued. Real estate transactions move smoother when the paperwork is clean from the beginning. I was planning to call her next. 20 minutes later, I was speaking with Dana Whitaker. Dana had the efficient voice of someone who had spent most of her career navigating contracts written by people who enjoyed hiding important details inside very small print. So let me understand this correctly, she said after I explained the situation. You want to purchase a house in Portland quickly with cash through the Kensington Legacy Trust, and you'd prefer the process to remain quiet. That's correct. Any reason the seller would reject a clean offer? None that I can think of. Then we can move fast, Dana replied. Cash offers without contingencies are usually welcome. Within 48 hours, the process had begun. Dana coordinated with a local real estate agent named Kevin Brooks, who arranged a private viewing of the property on Maplewood Drive. I drove there the following afternoon. Seeing the house from the sidewalk felt oddly familiar. Directly across the street stood Andrew's home, the same porch where my suitcase had rested beneath the yellow light just a few nights earlier. The blue house itself was quiet. Empty. Kevin unlocked the front door and gestured politely for me to enter. Inside, the rooms were filled with afternoon sunlight and the faint smell of old wood floors. The place needed a little care, a coat of paint here, a garden cleanup there, but structurally it was solid. The living room windows faced the street. From that position, I could see Andrew's driveway clearly. Kevin followed my gaze. Good neighborhood, he said conversationally. People stay here a long time. I can see why I replied. We walked through the kitchen, the 2 bedrooms, and a small study that looked perfect for my work desk. Everything about the house felt calm, uncomplicated, exactly the sort of place where a woman could run her business quietly while watching the seasons change through the front windows. When we stepped back onto the porch, Kevin asked the obvious question, "What do you think I said carefully that I'd like to make an offer?" The paperwork moved quickly after that. Cash purchases have a way of smoothing over delays. Dana drafted the documents. Allison confirmed the financial transfers through the trust. Kevin coordinated with the seller's agent, who sounded delighted at the prospect of a clean closing. By the end of the week, everything was nearly in place. There was only one thing I wanted to confirm before the process became final. That evening, I walked down Maplewood Drive again, this time simply observing the street the way any curious potential homeowner might. The tall trees, the quiet sidewalks, a woman watering flowers near the corner. She looked up as I passed. Looking at the blue house, she asked with an easy smile. I might be, I said. I'm Melissa Grant. She continued setting the watering can down beside her porch steps. I live 2 doors down. Laura? I replied. Melissa glanced toward Andrew's house across the street. You know, she said casually, there was a lot of conversation around here a few months ago when your son and his wife started talking about making room in their house. I stopped walking. Making room, I repeated. She nodded. Yeah? Tiffany mentioned it to a few of us while we were chatting out here one afternoon. Melissa hesitated slightly, as if reconsidering how much she should say. Then she added something that shifted the entire situation into a new and much clearer light. She said her mother-in-law was living with them temporarily, Melissa explained, but that it wouldn't be for long. Apparently, they were already planning ways to transition her out. For a moment, the quiet Portland street seemed to tilt slightly beneath my feet, not because the idea shocked me, but because hearing it spoken out loud confirmed something important. The night I was thrown out of that house had not been an impulsive argument. It had been a plan. And suddenly the house across the street felt even more interesting than it had before. For several seconds after Melissa finished speaking, neither of us moved. The quiet street around us remained unchanged, leaves shifting softly in the evening breeze, a car passing slowly at the end of the block, someone's porch light flickering on as the sky darkened. But inside my mind, the entire timeline of the past year began rearranging itself. "Are you sure about that?" I asked gently. Melissa nodded without hesitation. "Oh yes," she said. "It was sometime last fall. October, I think. A few of us were chatting out here one afternoon, me, Judith, from 2 houses down, and Thomas across the street." She pointed casually toward the houses as she spoke. "Tiffany mentioned that her husband's mother was living with them temporarily," Melissa continued. "She said they were trying to figure out how long that situation would last." My hands rested quietly in my coat pockets. "And what exactly did she say?" I asked. Melissa frowned, slightly concentrating. "Well, something like this," she said slowly. She laughed and said they were being patient, but that eventually they'd need the guest room for her candle business. She said once the older woman sold her house and settled things, they'd probably encourage her to find her own place. The word encourage lingered in the air between us. Not cruel, just deliberate. "Thank you," I said quietly. Melissa gave a small shrug. "I didn't think much about it at the time. Of course she hadn't. Why would she? People make casual comments about family all the time." But as I walked back toward my car that evening, something inside me settled with unusual clarity. The night Tiffany had called me a penniless old woman had not been the beginning of their plan. It had been the end of it. The planning had started months earlier, back when Andrew had first begun suggesting that selling the house in Salem might be a good idea. Back when Tiffany had begun mentioning how useful the guest room would be for her candle studio. Back when the idea of family living together had been presented as something warm and temporary. By the time my house sold in December, the next step had already been decided. They just hadn't told me. That realization didn't make me angry. Oddly enough, it made everything simpler, because once you understand the true shape of a situation, you can begin preparing for it properly. The next morning, I called Dana Whitaker. "I'd like to add one more thing to our documentation file," I told her. "What kind of documentation?" she asked. "Context," I replied. Dana listened quietly while I explained my conversation with Melissa. When I finished, she paused for a moment. "Do you want a formal statement?" she asked. "Yes." "That's easy enough," Dana said. "If your neighbor is willing to confirm what she heard, we can have it notarized. It may never be needed, but having a record is always wise." Melissa agreed without hesitation when I asked. 2 days later, we sat together at a small cafe near the river while Dana's assistant recorded the statement and arranged for a notary. Melissa seemed slightly embarrassed by the attention. "I didn't realize any of this was important," she said. "It may not be," I replied gently, "but clarity rarely hurts." With that piece of context quietly filed away, the rest of the process moved forward smoothly. The seller of the Blue Craftsman house had relocated to Arizona for a job and was eager to finalize the sale. Kevin Brooks handled the inspection and paperwork with the calm efficiency of someone who had seen hundreds of similar transactions. Dana oversaw the legal side through the Kensington Legacy Trust, ensuring the purchase remained private, and Allison confirmed that the funds transferred cleanly without disturbing the rest of my investment portfolio. 10 days after my first Zillow search, the closing documents were ready. The signing itself took less than an hour. I sat at a polished conference table in Dana's office while she slid each document toward me with a quiet explanation. Purchase agreement, trust verification, transfer confirmation. The pen moved steadily across each page. When the final signature was complete, Dana closed the folder neatly. "Well," she said with a small smile, "congratulations. You're now the owner of a house on Maplewood Drive." The following afternoon, I drove over with the keys. The neighborhood looked exactly as it had the first time I visited: quiet sidewalks, tall trees casting long shadows across the street, and a gentle breeze moving through the early spring leaves. Inside the house, the sunlight filled the rooms again. I carried my suitcase through the front door first, then my laptop bag, finally the 2 cardboard boxes containing Robert's things. For a moment, I stood in the center of the living room and simply listened to the silence. It felt different from the silence of the hotel room or the rented apartment. This silence felt settled. The movers arrived later that afternoon with the few additional items I had purchased: a desk for the study, a small dining table, a sofa, and a bed. Nothing extravagant, just the basic structure of a home. By early evening, the place was beginning to feel lived in. I placed the pothos plant from the apartment in the front window. From that position, I could see directly across the street. Andrew's house. The porch light turned on just as the sun began to set. A few minutes later, Andrew's car pulled into the driveway. I watched him step out carrying a laptop bag and a paper grocery sack. He looked tired. Work had probably run late. He walked halfway up the driveway before something caused him to pause, his head tilted slightly toward the blue house across the street. Toward my house. Across the street, the front door opened. I stepped out onto the porch. Andrew froze. For a moment, he simply stared at me as though his mind were struggling to place something familiar in an unexpected location. Behind him, the front door of his house opened again. Tiffany stepped onto their porch, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "What is it?" she asked. Andrew didn't answer. He was still staring across the street. Following his gaze, Tiffany turned toward the blue craftsman house, toward the woman standing calmly on the porch. And that was the exact moment both of them realized that the penniless old woman they had thrown out of their house was now living directly across the street. Andrew didn't move for several seconds. Across the street, the late afternoon light had turned soft and golden, the kind of quiet hour when most neighborhoods settle into their evening routines. A dog barked somewhere down the block. A car door closed 2 houses away. But the silence between us felt heavier than anything else on the street. Andrew was still standing halfway up his driveway, staring at me, as if the image in front of him refused to match whatever version of reality he had been carrying in his head. Behind him, Tiffany stepped forward onto their porch. "What is it?" she asked again. Andrew lifted one hand slowly and pointed across the street. Tiffany followed his gaze. Her expression changed almost instantly. At first there was confusion, then recognition, then something sharper, something that looked very much like disbelief. "What?" she said quietly. I remained where I was standing on the porch of the blue craftsman house, one hand resting lightly on the railing. For a moment, none of us spoke. Finally, Andrew crossed the street. He moved slowly, like someone approaching a problem that might disappear if he gave it enough time. When he reached the bottom of my porch steps, he stopped. "Mom," he said. I nodded once. "Hello, Andrew." He glanced up at the house behind me. "You live here?" "Yes." The word settled between us with quiet finality. Behind him, Tiffany had come down their front steps and followed across the street. She stopped beside Andrew, her arms folded tightly. "You bought this house?" she asked. "Yes." Her eyes moved briefly across the porch, the windows, the new plants beside the railing. "You just bought it?" I tilted my head slightly. "It was listed," I said calmly. "So I made an offer." Andrew ran one hand across the back of his neck, a gesture I remembered from when he was a teenager trying to explain a bad grade, how he asked. The question lingered in the air. I could see the assumptions behind it, the quiet picture he had been carrying of me for months. I answered simply, "With money." Tiffany's expression hardened. "That's not funny," she said. "I'm not joking." Andrew looked confused. "But you said I said nothing?" I replied gently. "You assumed." Neither of them responded, so I continued. "The house was purchased through the Kensington Legacy Trust," I explained calmly. "Cash offer. The closing was finalized yesterday." Andrew blinked. "You bought a $720,000 house in cash?" "Yes." For a moment, the only sound on the street was the rustle of wind through the maple tree above us. Then Tiffany laughed, but there was no humor in it. "That doesn't make sense," she said. "You told everyone you were living on a fixed income." "I never said that." Her eyes narrowed. "You let us believe it." I considered that for a moment. "Yes," I said. Andrew looked at me differently now, not with anger, at least not yet, more like someone slowly discovering that the ground beneath his feet wasn't as stable as he had thought. "Mom," he said quietly. "Why would you do that?" Because I replied softly, "People behave very honestly when they think you have nothing." Neither of them spoke. I stepped down from the porch. The wooden boards creaked lightly beneath my feet as I came to stand on the sidewalk in front of them. "I also want you to understand something else," I continued. I reached into my bag and pulled out a thin folder. Inside were several documents, copies neatly organized. Andrew looked uneasy. "What is that?" he asked. "Documentation," I said. Tiffany's eyes flicked toward the papers. Documentation of what? A conversation. I opened the folder and removed a single page. "About 6 months ago, I said you spoke with several neighbors here on Maplewood Drive." Her expression changed again, just briefly. "A casual conversation," she said quickly. "Yes," I replied. "About how your husband's mother was living with you temporarily. About how once she sold her house you planned to encourage her to move out." Andrew turned toward her. "Tiffany." She didn't look at him. "That's ridiculous," she said sharply. I handed the page to Andrew. It was a notarized statement. Signed, witnessed, recorded. Andrew read silently. The color drained slowly from his face. "Tiffany," he said again. It was just talk, she insisted. "People exaggerate things." Maybe I said calmly. I closed the folder and returned it to my bag. But here's the important part. Both of them looked at me. "We're neighbors now," I continued. My voice remained soft. "There are 2 ways this can work." The evening air had grown cooler and the streetlights were beginning to flicker on. "The first option," I said, "is that we treat each other politely. We live our lives on opposite sides of the street like reasonable adults." I paused. "The second option is that we make the last few months a much larger conversation." Neither of them asked what I meant. They didn't need to. Andrew lowered the paper slowly. "You're threatening us?" Tiffany said. "No," I replied. "I'm setting expectations." The wind moved gently through the maple branches above us. Finally, Andrew spoke. "Mom, this didn't have to become a war." I looked at him quietly. "You threw me out of your house." He looked down. For a moment, the 3 of us stood there in silence. Then I turned back toward my porch. "Good evening," I said softly, and I walked back inside. The adrenaline that had carried me through the conversation began to fade about 20 minutes later. My hands trembled slightly as I set a kettle on the stove. Confrontation has always left me that way, not frightened exactly, just aware of how much emotional energy it consumes. The kettle began to whistle softly. I poured a cup of tea and carried it to the living room. Across the street, Andrew and Tiffany's porch light was still on, but the curtains had been drawn. The following morning, I opened the front door and found a small wicker basket sitting on the porch. Inside were muffins, a jar of honey, and a folded card. On the front of the card, written in careful handwriting, were 2 words, "Fresh Start." I stared at it for a long moment. Then I carried the basket inside and placed it on the kitchen counter. I didn't throw it away, but I didn't answer it either. About an hour later, my phone buzzed. Andrew's name appeared on the screen. He didn't call. Instead, he left a voicemail. His voice sounded tired. "Mom, I think we should talk," he said. "Things got out of hand the other night. Maybe we can figure this out." There was a long pause before he added quietly, "Call me when you're ready." The message ended there. I set the phone down beside my tea and looked out the front window at the quiet street of Maplewood Drive. Something had changed. But the real consequences of that change were only just beginning to unfold. The street began to feel different a few days after the confrontation. Not dramatically. Nothing loud or obvious happened. Maplewood Drive remained the same quiet stretch of trees and front porches it had always been. But small things shifted. The first morning I noticed it was when I stepped outside to water the plants along the edge of my porch. Across the street, Andrew's car was gone. Tiffany's SUV remained in the driveway, but the curtains in their front windows stayed closed. That suited me just fine. I had no intention of turning the street into a battlefield. Instead, I did something much simpler. I began living there. Really living there. I worked at my desk in the front study each morning, while sunlight moved slowly across the hardwood floor. In the afternoons, I cleaned the small garden, trimming the neglected rose bushes and clearing away the winter weeds. By the third day, someone stopped on the sidewalk. "Good morning," a warm voice said. I looked up from the small shovel in my hand. A woman with silver hair and a blue cardigan stood beside the gate, holding a canvas grocery bag. "Judith Parker," she said with a friendly smile. "I live 2 houses down." I wiped my hands on a cloth and stepped toward the fence. "Laura Kensington," I replied. Judith glanced around the yard approvingly. "You're already making progress," she said. "That garden's been begging for attention since the previous owner left." "I enjoy plants," I said. She nodded toward the house across the street. "We all saw the little situation the other night," Judith added gently. Her tone wasn't intrusive, just observant. I met her eyes calmly. "Families are complicated," I said. Judith studied my face for a moment, then smiled again. "Well," she said, "this street tends to sort things out eventually." From that day forward, Maplewood Drive slowly began revealing its rhythm. Melissa Grant stopped by again one afternoon with a bag of lemons from her tree. "Thought you might like these," she said cheerfully. "Thank you," I replied. Later that week, I met Thomas Caldwell, the retired engineer Melissa had mentioned earlier. He was trimming hedges along the sidewalk when I walked past. "New neighbor," he said, nodding politely. "Yes. House suits you," he added simply. People on quiet streets rarely ask direct questions. Instead, they watch. They notice how you move through the world. Whether you wave, whether you return a borrowed tool, whether you speak calmly or complain loudly, and gradually, without formal discussion, they decide who you are. One evening, I found myself standing in Sofia Ramirez's front yard with several neighbors while she watered the flowers outside her small home daycare. Children's toys were scattered across the grass, bright plastic colors against the fading light of evening. "You're the one who bought the blue house," Sophia said with curiosity. "That's right." She tilted her head slightly. "I thought someone else might move in." "Plans change," I said. A few people exchanged quiet glances, not judgmental, just thoughtful. Over the next week, those small interactions continued. Judith waved each morning. Melissa asked about the progress on the garden. Thomas lent me a ladder to reach the higher branches of the maple tree. Slowly, almost invisibly, something important began to happen. The story of who I was on Maplewood Drive started changing, not through arguments, not through explanations, just through presence. People began seeing me as the woman who worked quietly in the mornings, the one who fixed the garden, the neighbor who returned borrowed tools cleaner than she received them. And once people form their own impression of you, older assumptions tend to fade. Across the street, Andrew and Tiffany remained mostly quiet. Andrew left early for work most mornings and returned late. Tiffany appeared less often on the porch where she had once chatted with neighbors. The balance of the street had shifted, and Tiffany understood that. People like her always do. Which is why one evening, while standing at my front window, watching the street settle into twilight, a quiet thought crossed my mind. The situation wasn't finished yet. Tiffany Mercer had built her confidence on controlling narratives, on shaping how people around her understood a situation. For the moment, that narrative had cracked. But I suspected something about her character. People who rely on control rarely abandon it easily. They simply pause, recalculate, and then return with a new strategy. 3 days passed before Andrew finally crossed the street again. That morning, I had finished my calls early and was reviewing invoices when I noticed movement through the front window. Andrew and Tiffany were walking toward my house. Andrew carried a white bakery box. Tiffany held a bouquet of flowers. For a moment, I watched them approach. Then I closed my laptop and opened the front door. "Hi, Mom," Andrew said. "Hello, Andrew." Tiffany lifted the flowers slightly. "We brought pastries," she said. "And flowers." "Thank you," I replied, stepping aside. "Come in." They entered slowly, looking around the living room as though measuring the space. Andrew placed the pastry box on the kitchen counter. "Nice place," he said quietly. "It is." Tiffany set the flowers on the table. "I didn't realize you were planning something like this," she said. "That's understandable." For a moment, no one spoke. Finally, Andrew cleared his throat. "Mom, about the other night." He paused. I think things got out of hand. Tiffany nodded quickly. Sometimes families say things they don't mean. That happens, I said calmly. Andrew gestured toward the living room. Maybe we could sit. We sat down. Andrew opened the pastry box and slid it across the table. Chocolate croissants, he said. I didn't reach for one. For a few minutes, the conversation stayed polite. Andrew asked about the house. Tiffany complimented the garden. Then Tiffany leaned forward slightly. Laura, she said gently, we've been thinking about what would be best for everyone going forward. That's thoughtful. She smiled. The situation on the street is a little awkward now, don't you think? Awkward living across from each other after everything that happened. I suppose that depends on how people behave, I said. Tiffany nodded. Exactly. She paused before continuing. We were wondering if you might consider something quieter. Quieter? Yes. There are some very nice retirement communities outside Portland. Peaceful places with activities, transportation support. Andrew looked up quickly. Tiffany. But she kept going. You wouldn't have to manage a house alone, she said, and you'd be around people your own age. I watched her carefully. You'd like me to move, I said. She lifted one shoulder. It might make things easier for everyone. Andrew rubbed his forehead. That's not exactly what we discussed, he muttered. Tiffany ignored him. After everything that's happened, she said a little distance might be healthier. The room fell quiet. Then I answered, no. Tiffany blinked. I'm sorry I said no. Andrew exhaled softly. Tiffany's smile disappeared. Laura? She said slowly. I'm trying to approach this respectfully. And I'm answering respectfully. Her voice cooled. You really think living across the street from us is going to work? Yes. She leaned forward. You may not realize this, but situations like this can become very uncomfortable. I imagine they can. Neighborhoods talk, she said. I've noticed. Her eyes narrowed. You're making this harder than it needs to be. I held her gaze. You threw me out of your house. Andrew closed his eyes briefly. Tiffany exhaled sharply. Well, she said, don't be surprised if things on this street don't turn out the way you expect. Andrew stood suddenly. That's enough. Tiffany stood as well. Thank you for the tea, she said coolly. I didn't serve tea. She ignored that and walked toward the door. Andrew paused. Mom. I'm sorry, he said quietly. Then he followed her outside. The house fell silent again. After a moment, I walked to the desk in the front study and opened my notebook. Important conversations should always be recorded while they are still fresh. I wrote down the date, the time, who had been present, and the final sentence Tiffany had spoken. Don't be surprised if things on this street don't turn out the way you expect. When I finished writing, I closed the notebook and placed it beside my laptop. Because in 2 days, Maplewood Drive was holding its monthly block association meeting, and something told me Tiffany Mercer was already planning how to use it. 2 evenings later, I walked to Sophia Ramirez's house carrying a small lemon loaf. The block association meeting was already underway when I arrived. Several neighbors were gathered around Sophia's dining table with iced tea and plates of snacks. Judith Parker sat near the window. Thomas Caldwell was at the end of the table. Melissa Grant stood by the counter. Across the room sat Andrew and Tiffany. Andrew looked tired. Tiffany looked composed. I placed the loaf on the counter and took a seat beside Judith. For the first part of the meeting, nothing unusual happened. Sophia discussed children crossing the street too quickly after school. Thomas mentioned a drainage issue near the curb. Judith suggested organizing a small spring cleanup. It was the kind of conversation that usually fills neighborhood meetings. Then Sophia mentioned the possibility of a summer block gathering. It might be nice, she said, for everyone to feel more connected this year. Tiffany responded immediately. Yes, community matters. Especially on a street like this. Melissa lifted her glass slightly. I agree, she said calmly. Community works best when people understand who their neighbors really are. The room grew quieter. Tiffany gave a small laugh. Of course. Melissa looked toward Andrew before she continued. For a while, I believed Laura was in a very different situation than she actually was. Sophia glanced at her. What do you mean? Melissa spoke carefully. I had the impression Laura was financially struggling and staying with family for support. Then she bought the blue house across the street. Thomas raised his eyebrows. She bought it outright, yes, I said simply. Tiffany's smile tightened. I don't think personal finances belong in a neighborhood meeting. Judith spoke from beside me. They do when public assumptions were created in the neighborhood first. Andrew stared at the table. Sophia looked toward me. Laura, she said gently, would you like to respond? I nodded. I supported myself after my husband passed away, I said. I built a business, sold my house, and chose where to live. That's the reality. The room remained quiet. Then Melissa added one more piece. There was also conversation last fall, she said evenly, about how Laura's stay with Andrew and Tiffany would be temporary once she sold her house. Tiffany turned toward her sharply. That's not what I said. Melissa didn't raise her voice. That's how it sounded. Thomas leaned back slightly. Then what exactly did you say? He asked. Tiffany opened her mouth, but the answer didn't come easily. Across the table, Andrew spoke instead. It wasn't accurate, he said quietly. The room turned toward him. Tiffany stared at him. Andrew. But he didn't continue. His silence said enough. Tiffany pushed her chair back. I think we're done here, she said. Andrew stood more slowly. Before leaving, he glanced toward me. There was something different in his face now, not confusion, shame. Then he followed Tiffany out the door. For a moment, the room remained still. Then Sophia quietly poured more tea and the conversation gradually returned to ordinary things, but the balance on Maplewood Drive had already shifted. By the next afternoon, most of the street understood what had happened. That evening, my phone rang. It was Dana Whitaker. I want you prepared for something, she said. Sometimes when people lose social ground, they try to create pressure legally. Complaints, claims, accusations. It doesn't mean they'll succeed. I looked out through the front window at the quiet street. If they try, I said calmly, we'll handle it. Dana paused. Yes, she said. You will. 3 days after the block meeting, Andrew came to my door alone. It was early evening. The street was quiet again, the way Maplewood Drive usually felt when the sun began to settle behind the trees. I was in the front yard watering the small row of roses along the fence. When I looked up, Andrew was standing at the edge of the walkway. He didn't step closer right away. For a moment, he simply stood there, hands in his jacket pockets, like someone rehearsing words that had taken too long to say. Hi, Mom, he said. Hello, Andrew. He glanced toward the house across the street. Tiffany's car wasn't there. I won't take much of your time, he said. That's all right. He walked slowly up the path and stopped near the porch. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he exhaled. I should have stopped it, he said quietly. The words landed with surprising weight. Stopped what I asked gently. All of it. His eyes moved toward the street, then back to me. The way things happened in the house. The night you left. The way Tiffany talked to you. He rubbed his hands together, a nervous habit I remembered from when he was young. I kept telling myself it wasn't that bad, he said. That things would calm down, and they didn't. No. The evening air moved softly through the maple branches above us. Andrew's voice dropped lower. We're separating, he said. I didn't react immediately. She wants to move, he continued. Somewhere else in the city. Says the neighborhood feels hostile now. He gave a small, tired smile. I guess she's not wrong. I rested the watering can beside the fence. Andrew, I said quietly, people usually feel uncomfortable when the story they were telling stops working. He nodded slowly. That's fair. For a moment, neither of us spoke again. Then he looked at me. I know an apology doesn't fix everything, he said, but I should have protected you. You were my mother before you were anything else. The words were simple, but they were the first honest ones he had said since all of this began. I appreciate you saying that, I replied. He shifted his weight slightly. Would you maybe have dinner with me sometime, he asked. Not a big thing, just dinner. I thought about the question for a moment, not about forgiveness, But about time. Dinner sounds reasonable, I said. Relief crossed his face, quiet but real. Thank you. We stood there a little longer talking about smaller things after that. Work, the weather, ordinary pieces of life that had felt impossible only a week earlier. Eventually, Andrew headed back across the street. The porch light flicked on behind him as he reached the driveway. I stayed in the yard for a while after he left. The evening had grown cooler, and the sky above Maplewood Drive had turned the deep blue that arrives just before night. Life was slowly settling into something calmer again. The garden would need more work in the spring. The business still kept me busy most mornings. And the street, despite everything, had begun to feel like a place where I belonged. Not because I had won anything, but because I had stayed. A little later, I sat beneath the old maple tree in the yard, listening to the quiet neighborhood around me. Sometimes peace doesn't arrive with applause or victory. Sometimes it simply appears when you realize you no longer need to prove anything. And I'm curious what you would do in a situation like this. If you were in my place, would you forgive your child after something like that, or would you keep your distance? Tell me what you think in the comments, and if stories like this interest you, don't forget to like the video, share it with someone who might relate, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story. Because sometimes the most important battles in life aren't loud ones. Sometimes they're the quiet moments when you decide exactly how much of your dignity you're willing to protect.